So the next thing we're going to do, we've defined what a disability is. Now we're going to define the class name. What does it mean to adapt activities for people with disabilities? So when we adapt an activity, what we want to do is take an activity and maximize inclusion, which means that every person, regardless of their abilities or disabilities, can participate in the same activity, in the same setting, with the same conditions as everyone else. And we want to do that in the least restrictive environment, which is a term that comes from the IDEA, which means that we want integration. We want everybody participating together. We want to avoid any situation where segregation will occur, where we would exclude people with disabilities, or even to segregation could be not just saying you can't come to this class. It could be saying we're going to create a separate class over there for you. And we do this a lot thinking that we're doing this for their benefit, but we're actually not. We're actually impairing them by separating them. And so there may be some cases where segregation is necessary. For example, if somebody had a behavioral issue where they were struggling with violence, that might be putting the person and the class at risk to include them in a class if there was going to be a situation that stimulated that behavioral issue. But as much as possible, we want to push for integration. So as much as they can be included in the class, that's the goal. So as long as we're looking for that, we're going to be doing a good job. Okay. The other thing that we want to think about when adapting activities is self-actualization. And that's just a really fancy word that means helping someone realize their potential. And this is the definition from Google's dictionary, if you type in a search term. So basically what we want to do is help individuals see their abilities, see all the things that they can do, and stop focusing on their disability. But first, that requires that we, ourselves, the professionals, also have to do that. We have to look beyond an amputated arm. We have to look beyond a visual impairment. We have to look beyond a wheelchair to see all the things that are still possible. For example, there is, we're going to be hanging out with group living a lot this semester. There is a guy that is a client there that has been coming, and every time I've seen him, he's been in an automated wheelchair to where the only movement, very little movement of one of his arms, and he uses the power wheelchair buttons to move around. Never ever seen him even flinch his legs. So the other day, this is all at group living or on campus. The other day, I ran into him and his caregiver at the dollar store, and he's using a manual wheelchair because his automated wheelchair didn't fit in her vehicle. And guess what? She wasn't pushing him. He was pulling himself with his legs around the store. And I thought to myself, okay, I just made a really stupid assumption that because he had an automated chair, he needed that automated chair to get around. But in actuality, he actually had more ability than I thought about. And if I had taken time to ask, we probably could have been pushing him beyond those limits this whole time. So now we know, and now we're going to be challenging him for sure. Okay, so when we're creating activities, a lot of times to be able to reach inclusion, to be able to produce self-actualization, it's going to require some modification. Sometimes that requires a different equipment. Sometimes it requires a different environment, different changes in the rules and the space. And the degree of adaptation is a wide spectrum. We'll talk about that on the next slide. But these are some examples of sports that have been adapted to fit individuals that have different needs. So one of those is basketball. So pretty common sport. I'm sure you all know kind of the gist of it. With wheelchair basketball, it's really almost exactly the same, except for that they're using wheelchairs. And they give a provision for dribbling to make it a little bit easier to push the chair and dribble the ball at the same time. So with wheelchair basketball in the Paralympics, even in professional competitions, I believe, just based on the way they do their disability scale, they have a point system for the degree of injury. And so technically, you could have somebody on the floor that has no disability whatsoever, as long as the other individuals are impaired to a significant degree to where it makes it equal overall. Kind of like if you averaged out the ability and disability of one team against another, they kind of weigh the same, even though one individual may not be impaired at all, if that makes any sense. We'll talk about this a little bit more when we get to the adapted sports. So that's using different equipment. The other one that we're going to talk about is, or show you, is the downhill skiing. And this is really cool. This is another one that's in the Paralympics. And so what they have is it's a chair that kind of sits on it, almost looks more like a snowboard than a ski. And so someone that has difficulty using their lower limbs could sit in that chair and still navigate the ski slopes pretty well. So you'll get to see all of those videos